The sky was never truly empty at night. It only looked that way. Darkness did not mean safety. Silence did not mean peace. High above the Pacific, engines whispered instead of roared. Pilots stared into black nothingness, trusting instruments they could not see. One mistake meant vanishing forever. There were no formations. No sunlight. No second chances. Somewhere in the dark, another aircraft was hunting. Not by sight. But by signal. By echoes bouncing through invisible space. Japan flew believing the night would hide them. America learned how to see without eyes. This was not dogfighting as the world knew it. It was patience versus panic. Technology versus instinct. Kills were sudden. Deaths were silent. Often, the enemy never knew who struck. The night sky never screamed. It simply swallowed men whole. These were the silent sky hunters. World War II is often remembered in daylight. Massive fleets. Burning cities. Endless columns of soldiers moving across open ground. But some of the war's most decisive battles unfolded where no one could see. Above the ocean. After sunset. As the Pacific conflict expanded, Japan relied on darkness as protection. Night bombing raids slipped through defenses. Reconnaissance aircraft crossed vast distances unseen. For a time, the night belonged to them. The United States was forced to adapt. Not with louder engines or larger formations. But with patience. With radar. With pilots trained to fight an enemy they could not see. These men did not chase silhouettes against the sun. They hunted faint signals on glowing scopes. Guided by voices in headsets. Trusting technology that was still new, fragile, and often unreliable. Every mission carried a different kind of fear. Not the chaos of open combat. But the pressure of waiting. Of knowing the enemy was nearby, yet invisible. This was a war measured in seconds and shadows. A contest where victory arrived without warning. And in that silent sky, America's night fighters changed the balance of the Pacific forever. At first, the night was simply ignored. Commanders planned for daylight. Pilots trained for sunlight. Weapons were designed to be aimed with eyes, not instruments. Darkness was treated as a pause. A gap between real battles. Japan understood this weakness early. The night offered distance. It offered confusion. It offered survival. Japanese aircraft began appearing after sunset. Bombers crossed long stretches of ocean unseen. Reconnaissance planes gathered intelligence without interception. Airfields that felt secure during the day became vulnerable by night. American defenses struggled to respond. Searchlights swept empty skies. Anti-aircraft fire guessed instead of aimed. Fighters climbed blindly, burning fuel, finding nothing. Pilots described the experience as fighting a ghost. You heard engines. You felt presence. But you saw nothing. The psychological effect was immediate. Crews slept less. Tension grew. Every unfamiliar sound triggered alarms. Darkness magnified fear. It removed reference points. Altitude became uncertain. Distance became deceptive. A single mistake could be fatal. Lose the horizon, and spatial awareness collapsed. Trust your instincts, and they betrayed you. Meanwhile, Japanese crews grew confident. The night became routine. A shield against interception. But advantage breeds complacency. And complacency invites countermeasures. American planners began to realize something critical. The night itself was not the enemy. Blindness was. If sight could not be trusted, it had to be replaced. If eyes failed, machines would have to see. This shift did not happen quickly. It required new thinking. New technology. New kinds of pilots. Men willing to fly alone. Men willing to trust a glowing screen over instinct. Men willing to enter darkness without expecting to return. The war was no longer confined to visible space. It was expanding into something colder. Quieter. The sky after sunset was becoming a battlefield of patience. Of signals. Of shadows. And once America learned how to fight there, the night would never belong to Japan again. The solution did not come from bravery alone. Bravery already existed. What was missing was vision. Not human vision. Electronic vision. Radar had existed before the war. But it was bulky. Unreliable. And never meant to be placed inside a fighter aircraft. Yet necessity leaves little room for doubt. Engineers were pushed beyond comfort. Pilots were asked to trust machines they barely understood. Commanders approved designs that felt experimental at best. The aircraft themselves were different. Heavier. Less agile. Packed with unfamiliar equipment. Antennas protruded from noses and wings. Radar operators were added behind the pilot. Cockpits became crowded with dials, scopes, and glowing screens. Flying these machines required a new mindset. Speed mattered less than patience. Aggression mattered less than control. Pilots trained to resist instinct. To ignore what their eyes told them. To follow instructions whispered through headsets in complete darkness. The learning curve was brutal. Night landings ended in wreckage. Spatial disorientation killed experienced aviators. Some never fired a single shot in combat. But those who survived learned something powerful. The darkness could be mapped. Distance could be measured. Targets could be tracked without ever being seen. For the first time, an enemy could be hunted before it knew it was exposed. Coordination became everything. Ground controllers guided fighters into position. Radar operators spoke calmly as tension peaked. Pilots waited for the exact moment to strike. There was no room for panic. No room for ego. A single mistake erased aircraft and crew instantly. Slowly, confidence replaced uncertainty. Interceptions increased. Night raids grew riskier for Japan. What had once been a shield was becoming a trap. These were not traditional fighter squadrons. They operated quietly. Often unnoticed. Rarely celebrated. Yet their impact grew with every successful mission. America was no longer blind after sunset. The night sky had been opened. Measured. Controlled. And the hunters were finally ready. Once airborne, nothing felt familiar. The horizon disappeared. The ocean below became a single black mass. Sky and sea blended into one endless void. Inside the cockpit, vision narrowed to instruments. Altimeter. Compass. Radar scope glowing faintly in the dark. The pilot no longer hunted with eyes. He hunted with trust. Beside him, the radar operator watched a moving line of light. A blip appeared. Then faded. Then returned. Distance was calculated in calm voices. Headings were adjusted by degrees. Speed was reduced. Every movement was deliberate. There was no rush. Rushing meant noise. Noise meant detection. Japanese aircraft often never realized they were being followed. They flew believing the night still protected them. Engine steady. Course unchanged. Behind them, an American fighter closed in silently. The final moments were the most dangerous. Too close, and collision was inevitable. Too far, and the target vanished into darkness. Pilots described their hands shaking on the controls. Not from fear of the enemy, but from fear of misjudgment. The radar operator counted down distance. Miles became fractions. Fractions became seconds. Then, at last, the enemy appeared. Not clearly. Not fully. A shadow. A shape. A darker stain against black sky. There was no dramatic chase. No turning dogfight. No warning shots. Fire erupted suddenly. Cannons flashed. The sky lit for a brief moment. Then darkness returned. Often, the enemy aircraft was simply gone. Falling unseen. Unrecorded. Unwitnessed. Sometimes wreckage was never found. No smoke. No explosion. Just absence. American pilots rarely celebrated. There was no confirmation. No cheering formation. Just silence. The pressure of these missions accumulated quickly. Sleep became shallow. Dreams were filled with static and blinking scopes. Each sortie demanded perfect focus. Fatigue was punished immediately. Yet the results were undeniable. Night raids declined. Reconnaissance flights shortened. Japanese crews grew cautious. The hunters had changed the rules. Darkness was no longer neutral ground. It was hostile. Measured. Controlled. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan feared the night sky. And the silent sky hunters continued their patrols. Flying into blackness. Guided only by instruments. Waiting patiently for the next signal to appear. For Japan, the night had once been freedom. Now it was uncertainty. Japanese pilots began to notice changes they could not explain. Aircraft failed to return from routine missions. Crews vanished without distress calls. No enemy was ever seen. There were no warning shots. No visible pursuit. Just loss. Japan's air doctrine had never been built for this kind of war. Fighters were designed for daylight engagements. For visual contact. For aggressive maneuvering under open skies. Radar existed, but in limited form. Coverage was incomplete. Airborne systems were rare and unreliable. Most Japanese pilots still relied on eyesight alone. In darkness, eyesight meant almost nothing. Night interceptions became desperate guesses. Searchlights swept blindly. Ground fire filled the sky without targets. Pilots were sent aloft with little guidance. Minimal training. Almost no chance of success. The psychological pressure mounted quickly. Fear replaced confidence. Every mission felt like flying into a trap. Some crews altered routes repeatedly. Others flew lower, risking accidents. Many shortened missions to avoid exposure. None of it solved the core problem. The enemy was no longer reacting. He was waiting. American night fighters chose the moment of contact. They controlled distance. They controlled timing. Japan reacted only after impact. Losses mounted quietly. No dramatic defeats. No single disaster. Just steady erosion. Experienced pilots were lost without replacement. Training pipelines could not keep pace. Fatigue became constant. The night, once trusted, became hostile. Pilots questioned every shadow. Every sound in the cockpit felt threatening. Some crews described the sky as watching them. Listening. Measuring. Technology had shifted the balance without spectacle. Without announcement. Japan's strength had relied on momentum. On initiative. On confidence. Night fighters stole all three. By the time Japanese command recognized the threat fully, options were limited. Resources were strained. Time was gone. The night war had exposed a truth that daylight concealed. Courage alone could not overcome invisibility. Skill could not defeat signals it could not detect. And slowly, relentlessly, Japan's control of the night sky faded into silence. The night war was never only about machines. Radar could detect. Instruments could guide. But they could not decide. That burden remained human. Every interception demanded trust. Trust in equipment. Trust in training. Trust in another man's voice cutting through static. Pilots had been trained to rely on instinct. To feel the aircraft. To read the sky. At night, instinct became dangerous. The urge to look outside had to be resisted. The temptation to chase had to be suppressed. Aggression had to be controlled. Success came from restraint. Radar operators faced their own pressure. They never saw the target. They interpreted shadows on a screen. A single misread could send an aircraft into empty darkness. Communication was everything. Clear words. Calm tone. Perfect timing. Seconds mattered. Hesitation killed. The pilot waited for instructions. Adjusted heading by degrees. Reduced speed without question. In that moment, hierarchy dissolved. The man behind the scope became the eyes. The pilot became the instrument. Fear never vanished. It adapted. There was fear of collision. Fear of spatial disorientation. Fear of firing too late. There was also fear of firing too early. Of revealing position. Of missing completely. Experience shaped judgment. Veterans learned when to break off. When to commit. When the night was lying. Technology extended reach. But it could not replace courage. When radar failed, instinct returned. When radios cut out, decisions were immediate. Survival depended on balance. Between data and intuition. Between patience and action. This balance defined night aces. Not kill counts. Not medals. Their victories were often unconfirmed. Their names rarely remembered. Yet their impact was undeniable. They proved that modern warfare was changing. Seeing was no longer believing. Information mattered more than vision. The night sky became a test of discipline. Of humility. Of trust in something unseen. And those who mastered that balance became hunters without faces. Fighting a war where instinct alone was no longer enough to survive. There was no single night that marked victory. No announcement. No turning point the world noticed. The change revealed itself slowly. Japanese night raids grew less frequent. Reconnaissance flights avoided certain routes. Bombers turned back earlier than planned. The sky was still dark. But it was no longer safe. American night fighters did not dominate through spectacle. They dominated through presence. Through uncertainty. Every mission forced Japan to assume danger. Every flight carried hesitation. Every shadow became suspicious. The effect spread beyond aircraft losses. Fuel was wasted on detours. Schedules were disrupted. Confidence eroded. Air crews began flying higher. Then lower. Then not at all. Resources were redirected to counter a threat that could not be seen. Searchlights multiplied. Anti-aircraft fire increased. Radar stations were expanded. None of it restored control. The night fighters had already done their work. They forced the enemy to react instead of act. To defend instead of strike. This was victory measured in absence. In missions that never launched. In bombs that never fell. The success of night interception reshaped strategy. Air superiority no longer depended on daylight. Time itself became a weapon. For American pilots, the war remained exhausting. There was no relief. No applause waiting on landing strips. Just debriefs. Maintenance. Another night approaching. They flew knowing their impact would never be fully recorded. No cameras followed them into darkness. No eyewitnesses confirmed their kills. But command knew. Enemy behavior told the story. The sky had been claimed without noise. Without celebration. Control had shifted permanently. The night was no longer neutral space. It had been mapped. Measured. Denied to the enemy. Victory did not arrive in flames. It arrived quietly. And in that silence, America's night fighters secured an advantage that daylight alone could never have achieved. When the war ended, the night looked unchanged. The same stars. The same darkness. The same silence. But what had happened within it could never be undone. America's night fighters did not reshape history with spectacle. They did it with restraint. With patience. With control. They proved that power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it waited. Listened. Measured. The men who flew these missions returned without parades. Without headlines. Often without recognition. Many could not explain what they had done. How do you describe fighting something you never truly saw? Their victories were not etched into photographs. They existed in missing aircraft. In abandoned routes. In plans that were quietly cancelled. The night fighters forced a new truth into warfare. That information could defeat courage. That discipline could defeat aggression. The sky after sunset became a place of calculation. Of invisible boundaries. Of unseen consequences. For Japan, the night lost its promise. It no longer offered safety. Only uncertainty. For America, it became proof of adaptation. Of learning faster than the enemy. Of mastering fear instead of fleeing from it. These battles left no ruins on the ground. No cities burned. No flags raised. Yet they shaped the air war that followed. And the wars that came after. Modern air combat was born in that darkness. Where pilots trusted machines more than eyes. Where silence was louder than gunfire. The silent sky hunters never claimed the night with noise. They claimed it by understanding it. And long after the engines shut down, the sky remembered. It stayed quiet. Because it had already spoken enough.